Grace Whitmore was 26 years old when she signed her name to a business plan that every bank in her city refused to fund. She had $1,100 in her checking account, a second-hand laptop with a cracked corner, and a husband named Robert who believed, like everyone else did, that she was simply running a small online shop to help pay the bills. He kissed her goodbye every morning and never once asked to see the numbers. He never asked because he never imagined there was anything worth asking about. What Robert did not know, what nobody outside a small circle of investors and lawyers knew, was that the woman making coffee in his kitchen every morning was quietly building something that would one day be worth more than $80 billion. For years Grace kept two lives running side by side inside the same small house. In one life she was a wife, folding laundry, remembering birthdays, sitting across the dinner table listening to Robert talk about his day at work. In the other life she was closing deals that would make grown men in tailored suits nervous, signing contracts that reshaped entire industries, and building a company so large that its name would eventually appear on the same lists as Apple and Amazon. She told herself she was protecting him. She told herself the stress of it all, the pressure, the enemies that come with real power, were things he did not need to carry. She believed, right up until the night everything changed, that her silence was an act of love. But love built on silence has a way of curdling into something else entirely, and on one particular night, in a house that looked like every other house on that quiet street, Robert Whitmore finally learned the truth. He did not learn it gently. He did not learn it from Grace sitting him down at the kitchen table with the patience the moment deserved. He learned it by accident, through a single phone call he was never meant to overhear, and in the span of about 90 seconds, the entire architecture of his marriage collapsed in front of him. Every dinner, every anniversary, every quiet Sunday morning suddenly looked like a lie he had been living inside without ever knowing it. What happened next is the part of this story that still, to this day, divides everyone who hears it. Some people call Robert a broken man who made one desperate mistake in the worst moment of his life. Others call him something far more dangerous. Because that night, standing beside the pool in their own backyard, Robert Whitmore took the phone out of his wife's hand, the same phone that held $80 billion worth of secrets, and threw it into the water. He did not do it to end an argument. He did it, according to everything that came out later, to stop her from making a single phone call. The question that will follow you through this entire story is simple. What call was so dangerous that a husband would rather destroy the evidence than let his wife make it? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time this story ends, you will understand exactly why that phone call was worth more than most companies will ever be worth in their entire existence, and why a man who loved his wife for 15 years believed, even for just one night, that throwing her phone into a swimming pool was the only way to save what little he had left. This is the story of Grace and Robert Whitmore. A marriage. An empire. And one night by the water that neither of them would ever be able to take back. They were married 4 years later in a small church that Grace's parents had attended their entire lives, in front of about 60 guests, most of them family, a handful of them Robert's co-workers from the accounting firm where he had just started his first job out of college. Grace did not have a job yet in the traditional sense. She had an idea, a strange and ambitious idea about small sensors that could be attached to industrial machinery to predict when a part was about to fail before it actually failed, saving factories millions of dollars in downtime. Nobody in her family understood exactly what she meant when she explained it. Robert did not fully understand it either, but he loved the way her eyes lit up when she talked about it, and on their wedding night, half joking, he told her that one day her little sensors were going to make them rich. Neither of them had any idea how true that sentence would eventually become. The first 3 years of the marriage were, by every account from people who knew them, genuinely happy ones. They lived in a rented 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. Robert worked long hours at the accounting firm, slowly climbing toward a junior partner position. Grace worked even longer hours in the second bedroom, which she had converted into a workshop cluttered with wires, prototype boards, and a whiteboard covered in equations that Robert eventually stopped trying to read. She sold her first batch of sensors to a small manufacturing plant 2 towns over, earning less than $4,000 total, and she came home that night so excited that Robert took her out to the only restaurant they could afford to celebrate, a diner that stayed open until midnight. He proposed a toast with 2 glasses of orange juice because neither of them drank alcohol back then. He told her he was proud of her. At that point in the story, he meant every word of it. What almost nobody outside of Grace's earliest circle of engineers and investors understood was just how quickly her small sensor company, which she eventually named Meridian Dynamics, began to attract serious attention. Within 2 years, a mid-sized manufacturing conglomerate approached her with an offer to license her technology across their entire network of factories. Grace, against the advice of almost everyone she spoke to, turned the offer down. She did not want to license her technology to one company. She wanted to build a company of her own that could serve every factory, every warehouse, every shipping yard in the country. She used the licensing offer as leverage to attract her first serious round of outside investment, and within 6 months she had raised enough money to hire her first 10 employees and rent a small office space outside of the apartment she shared with Robert. This is the point in the story where the 2 lives of Grace Whitmore truly began to separate from each other. At home, she was still the same woman Robert had married, tired after long days, affectionate in the evenings, still doing her share of the grocery shopping and the laundry on the weekends. At the office, she was becoming something else entirely, a founder who negotiated with investors twice her age, who fired underperforming engineers without flinching, who flew to meetings in cities Robert had never visited and came home describing them only as boring business trips. Robert, for his part, was proud of her success, at least in the beginning, but he also noticed, almost without realizing it, that the numbers she mentioned kept getting smaller in conversation than what he later found out they actually were. When she raised $8 million in her second funding round, she told him it was, in her words, a decent chunk of money. She did not tell him the actual figure. This pattern, small omissions dressed up as modesty, would repeat itself for the next 12 years of their marriage. While Grace's company grew year after year, Robert's own career followed a much quieter path. He made junior partner at his accounting firm around the same time Meridian Dynamics closed its 3rd major funding round, and for a brief period the 2 of them felt like equals again, 2 professionals climbing their own separate ladders. But ladders climb at different speeds, and Robert's, however respectable, could not keep pace with what Grace was building. By the time their 10th wedding anniversary arrived, Meridian Dynamics had expanded into artificial intelligence-powered logistics software, a pivot that multiplied the company's value almost overnight. Grace was now regularly meeting with people whose names appeared on national news broadcasts. Robert, meanwhile, was reviewing tax filings for mid-sized local businesses, work he had once found satisfying but now, standing next to his wife's trajectory, felt smaller with every passing year. Friends who knew the couple during this period describe a slow and quiet shift in Robert's personality. He had always been a supportive husband, the kind of man who bragged about his wife at dinner parties, but somewhere around year 10, the bragging started to feel forced, almost rehearsed, as though he were performing pride rather than feeling it. He began making small comments at social gatherings, jokes about being married to the boss, jokes that landed a little too sharply to be entirely comfortable. He started spending more time with a close friend from college named Mark Doyle, a man who worked in commodities trading and who had a habit of talking about money in a way that made Robert visibly uncomfortable and visibly interested at the same time. Nobody thought much of this friendship at the time. Looking back, almost everyone interviewed for this story points to those long nights with Mark Doyle as the moment things quietly began to change. Grace, absorbed in the demands of running a company that now employed over 2,000 people, did not notice the shift in her husband as clearly as their friends did. She was traveling more, sleeping less, and relying heavily on her closest business partner, a co-founder named Daniel Cross, who had joined the company in its 2nd year and had become, over time, not just a colleague but one of her only true confidants. She and Daniel spent long hours together, late nights preparing for board meetings, early mornings reviewing financial projections before anyone else arrived at the office. Robert saw the phone calls. He saw the late nights. He saw the closeness. And slowly, Without any actual evidence, he began building a story in his own mind about what that closeness might mean, a story that had nothing to do with what was actually happening inside Meridian Dynamics, and everything to do with his own growing insecurity about his place in his wife's life. Here is the detail that changes everything about how you should understand this story, a detail that would not come to light until months after the incident by the pool. While Robert Whitmore spent years quietly resenting his wife's success and quietly suspecting her of an emotional affair with Daniel Cross that never actually existed, he himself was keeping a secret far more dangerous than anything Grace had ever hidden from him. Mark Doyle, his commodities trading friend, had spent years subtly encouraging Robert to share small, seemingly harmless details about Meridian Dynamics, details Robert picked up from overheard phone calls, glimpsed documents left open on the kitchen counter, and offhand comments Grace made when she thought she was simply venting about her day. Mark used these details, pieces of information about upcoming partnerships, unreleased product launches, and early signs of acquisition talks, to make a series of highly profitable trades in the market. At first, Robert told himself he was not doing anything wrong. He was not the one making the trades. He was not the one profiting directly, at least not in any way he could not explain away to himself as harmless gossip between old friends. But over 3 years, Mark Doyle's trades became increasingly specific, increasingly timed with uncanny precision around Meridian Dynamics announcements, and increasingly profitable, to the point where Mark began quietly depositing money into an account Robert had opened without Grace's knowledge, an account Robert used to pay off personal debts, fund a car he told Grace he had financed through a dealership, and slowly build a financial cushion that made him feel, for the first time in over a decade, like a man who was contributing something of real value rather than living in the shadow of his wife's empire. By the time regulators at the Securities and Exchange Commission began quietly investigating a pattern of unusual trading activity connected to Meridian Dynamics, a pattern their internal systems had flagged nearly a year earlier, Robert Whitmore had convinced himself that what he had done could never actually be traced back to him. He was not an employee of the company. He was not a public figure. He was simply a husband who occasionally mentioned things to an old friend. What Robert did not understand, what he could not have understood without a law degree of his own, was that insider trading investigations rarely stop at the person who executed the trades. They follow the information all the way back to its source. And the source, in this case, traced back through Mark Doyle, through a pattern of specific and repeated conversations, directly to the kitchen table where Robert and Grace Whitmore ate breakfast together every single morning of their married life. The night that would end up defining the rest of both of their lives began, according to everyone who has since pieced together the timeline, as an ordinary Thursday evening in late autumn. Meridian Dynamics was in the final stages of closing an acquisition deal that would value the company at just over $80 billion, a deal Grace had spent the better part of 2 years negotiating, and a deal that was scheduled to be publicly announced the following Monday morning. Grace had come home earlier than usual that night, exhausted but relieved, planning to finally sit Robert down and tell him, in full, exactly what she had built, exactly what the company was worth, and exactly what their lives were about to become. For years she had rehearsed this conversation in her head. She had decided that once the deal closed, once the secret could no longer serve any purpose, she would finally let her husband see the full picture. She never got the chance to have that conversation on her own terms, because at around 9 in the evening, while Robert was in the next room, Grace received an urgent call from her general counsel, a sharp and careful attorney named Patricia Newell, informing her that the SEC's investigation into unusual trading activity had produced a name, and that name was Robert Whitmore. Patricia explained, in the calm and controlled tone lawyers use when delivering the worst possible news, that regulators believed Robert had been the unwitting or possibly knowing source of leaked information that had fueled Mark Doyle's trades for years, and that if this connection became public before the acquisition closed, it could collapse the entire $80 billion deal, trigger a wave of lawsuits, and potentially expose Grace herself to allegations that she had failed to control information inside her own household. Patricia told her she needed to make one more call immediately, to the company's outside crisis counsel, before the story had any chance of leaking to the press. Grace, stunned and shaking, walked out to the backyard to make that call in private, phone in hand, only to find Robert already standing near the pool, having overheard just enough of her half of the earlier conversation through the kitchen window to understand, with sudden and complete clarity, that his own secret was about to be exposed. In his mind, in that single terrified moment, the phone in his wife's hand was not a tool for saving the company. It was the instrument that was about to destroy him, expose him to federal investigators, and end his marriage in the most humiliating way imaginable. He did not think about consequences. He did not think about the $80 billion deal or the reporters who would eventually descend on their quiet street. He thought only of stopping that one phone call, and in a moment of pure panic, he grabbed the phone from Grace's hand and threw it as far as he could into the pool. Grace stood at the edge of that pool for nearly a full minute without moving, staring at the faint glow of the phone screen slowly dimming beneath the water, while Robert stood a few feet away, breathing heavily, unable to explain, in that moment, why he had just done what he had done. She did not scream. She did not cry, at least not yet. She turned, walked back into the house, picked up the landline phone in the kitchen that neither of them had used in years, and calmly called Patricia Newell back to explain what had just happened. Within an hour, a company car had arrived to take Grace to a hotel downtown, and within 24 hours, a small legal and communications team had begun quietly working to contain a crisis that, if handled incorrectly, threatened to unravel not just a marriage but a business empire that thousands of employees depended on for their livelihoods. News of the incident did not break immediately, but when it did, 3 days later, it broke through an unexpected source, a neighbor across the street who had heard raised voices that night and had seen Grace's car leave in the early hours of the morning. The story that first circulated online was incomplete and, in many ways, deeply unfair to Grace, painting the incident as a simple case of a controlling husband trying to physically stop his wife from leaving him, without any of the deeper financial context that had actually caused the confrontation. Reporters camped outside the Meridian Dynamics headquarters. Business analysts speculated openly about whether the $80 billion acquisition would collapse under the weight of a personal scandal involving the company's own founder. Robert, meanwhile, said nothing to the press, retreating into a silence that many people at the time interpreted as guilt, and which turned out, in the end, to be exactly that, though not for the reasons anyone initially assumed. Inside Meridian Dynamics, the board of directors convened an emergency session within 48 hours of the story breaking, demanding answers from Grace about what exactly had happened and whether any confidential company information had been compromised. It was in this meeting, under direct and pointed questioning from board members who had every right to be concerned about their $80 billion investment, that Grace made the difficult decision to disclose the full truth, that the SEC's investigation had identified her own husband as the likely source of leaked information behind Mark Doyle's trading activity. The room, according to two people who were present, went completely silent. Grace later described that silence as the moment she understood that her marriage, in any form she had once imagined it, was already over, regardless of what happened next in the investigation or in the courts. Over the following weeks, federal investigators built a detailed timeline connecting Mark Doyle's trades to specific conversations he had shared with Robert Whitmore, conversations Mark himself eventually confirmed once he understood the severity of the legal exposure he was facing. Text messages recovered from Mark's phone showed a pattern stretching back nearly 3 years, casual-sounding messages that, once decoded by investigators familiar with the language traders sometimes used to disguise sensitive tips, revealed a clear and repeated exchange of confidential information in return for a steady stream of money deposited into the account Robert had hidden from his wife. Robert, faced with the evidence, eventually retained his own defense attorney, a measured and experienced litigator named Harold Grant, who advised him to cooperate fully with investigators in the hope of reducing whatever charges might eventually be filed against him. During this period, the public narrative around the story shifted dramatically, moving away from the simple image of a jealous husband and toward a much more complicated portrait of a man who had spent years quietly monetizing his wife's success behind her back while simultaneously resenting her for that same success in front of her. Business journalists who had originally focused their coverage on the pool incident itself began digging into Robert's financial history, uncovering the account, the payments from Mark Doyle, and the pattern of small debts Robert had quietly paid off over the years using money that had never been reported to Grace, to their joint tax filings, or to anyone else in their lives. What had once looked like a story about a controlling husband was slowly revealing itself to be a story about a man who had built an entire secret financial life inside a marriage defined, on the surface, by absolute trust. Grace, throughout this period, found herself in the strange position of testifying, both to her own company's board and eventually to federal investigators, about conversations she barely remembered having, offhand comments about the company that she had made at her own kitchen table, never once imagining that those comments were being carried out of her home and sold to a trader who had made millions of dollars from information she had shared out of nothing more than simple exhaustion after a long day at work. She described the experience, in a private conversation with Patricia Newell that was later referenced in court filings, as feeling as though her own home, the one place she had always considered completely safe, had been quietly turned into a listening device for over 3 years without her knowledge. The full picture finally came together during a deposition 6 months after the night by the pool, when Mark Doyle, facing the possibility of significant prison time, agreed to a plea arrangement that required him to testify in complete detail about his arrangement with Robert. It was during this deposition that the true motive behind Robert's actions that night finally became clear to everyone involved, including, in many ways, Grace herself. Robert had not thrown the phone into the pool to stop Grace from calling a divorce attorney, or from calling Daniel Cross, or from calling anyone connected to some imagined affair that had existed only in his own anxious imagination for years. He had thrown it because, in that single panicked moment, he genuinely believed his wife was seconds away from discovering, and reporting, the exact crime he had been quietly committing against her for 3 straight years. This revelation reframed nearly every moment of tension that had built up over the final years of their marriage. The secretive late-night phone calls Grace had noticed Robert taking in the garage were not, as she had once feared, calls to another woman, but calls to Mark Doyle, coordinating the timing of trades around company announcements Robert had overheard. The unexplained new car, the quietly paid-off credit card balances, the sudden willingness to cover unexpected expenses without any visible increase in his accounting salary, all of it traced back to the same hidden account, funded by information Robert had extracted, piece by piece, from the woman who trusted him completely. Grace, sitting through the deposition, later told a close friend that the hardest part was not learning that Robert had done something illegal. The hardest part was realizing that every small act of generosity he had shown her over those 3 years had, in some way, been paid for with her own stolen secrets. For his part, Robert, when finally given the opportunity to speak on the record, offered an explanation that many people found difficult to fully condemn, even as they struggled to excuse it. He described feeling, for over a decade, like a passenger in his own marriage, watching his wife build something extraordinary while he quietly shrank in comparison, and he described Mark Doyle's proposal, all those years earlier, as the first thing that had made him feel like he was contributing something of real value rather than simply riding alongside Grace's success. He did not deny what he had done. He simply tried, in his own words, to explain how a man who genuinely loved his wife had convinced himself, one small conversation at a time, that what he was doing could never actually hurt her. The legal consequences that followed were significant, though not as severe as some had initially predicted. Mark Doyle, as the individual who had directly executed the illegal trades, received the harshest sentence, a term of federal prison time combined with the forfeiture of nearly all the profits he had made over the 3-year scheme. Robert, having cooperated fully once the truth came out and having never directly profited from executing any trade himself, reached a plea agreement that avoided prison but required him to forfeit the money in his hidden account, pay significant financial penalties, and accept a lasting ban from any involvement in trading-related activity for the rest of his professional life. For a man who had spent years quietly trying to prove his own financial worth, the final judgment against him carried a particular kind of irony that was not lost on anyone following the story closely. The $80 billion acquisition, against nearly everyone's early predictions, ultimately survived the scandal, in large part because Grace and her legal team moved quickly and transparently once the truth became clear, disclosing the full situation to the acquiring company's board well before any regulatory findings became public. The acquiring company's leadership, after careful review, concluded that Grace herself had done nothing wrong, that she had been the unknowing victim of her own husband's secret conduct rather than any kind of willing participant, and the deal closed only 6 weeks later than originally planned. Meridian Dynamics emerged from the crisis not weaker, but in some ways stronger, its leadership having demonstrated under intense public scrutiny exactly the kind of transparency and accountability that investors and employees alike had hoped the company stood for all along. Grace and Robert's divorce was finalized quietly, almost anticlimactically, given everything that had led to it, roughly 8 months after the night by the pool. There was no dramatic courtroom confrontation, no final explosive argument caught by waiting cameras. There was simply a settlement, negotiated carefully by attorneys on both sides, and a shared acknowledgement, spoken plainly by both Grace and Robert in separate interviews conducted months later, that whatever had once existed between them, built across nearly 2 decades starting with a cup of vending machine coffee in a college library, had been slowly and quietly destroyed long before that phone ever hit the water. The pool, in the end, had not caused the end of their marriage. It had simply been the moment everything that had already broken finally became impossible to ignore. Today, Grace Whitmore continues to lead Meridian Dynamics, now operating as an independent division inside the much larger company that acquired it, overseeing a workforce that has grown to include thousands of employees across multiple continents. Colleagues describe her as more guarded now than she was before the incident, more careful about what she shares even with people she trusts completely, a change that several close friends attribute directly to the 3 years she unknowingly spent being quietly monitored inside her own home. She has spoken publicly, on a small number of occasions, about the importance of financial transparency inside marriages and families, without ever naming Robert directly, choosing instead to let her own story serve as a quiet warning to others who might be tempted to build separate financial lives, whether out of protection, resentment, or simple pride. Robert Whitmore, for his part, has largely stayed out of public view since the settlement, working in a much smaller advisory role that keeps him far away from any position involving confidential financial information. Those who have spoken with him since describe a man who has expressed genuine remorse, not simply for the legal consequences he faced, but for the years he spent resenting his wife's success instead of finding his own sense of purpose separate from her achievements. He has, according to people close to him, specifically pointed to that single moment beside the pool, the instinct to destroy the phone rather than face the truth it represented, as the clearest illustration of exactly how far his fear and insecurity had carried him from the man he once believed himself to be. What remains, in the end, is a story that resists any simple lesson, a story about a marriage built on genuine love that was slowly hollowed out from both directions at once, by a wife who protected her husband with silence he never asked for, and by a husband who protected his own fragile pride with secrets far more dangerous than anything he ever accused her of hiding. It raises questions that go far beyond the $80 billion company at the center of it all. What do we actually owe each other in a marriage when it comes to the full truth of our lives? And how much damage can quietly accumulate, year after year, inside a relationship where both people are convinced they are the one protecting the other, right up until the night one single phone call reveals that neither of them was protecting anything at all. So now that you have heard the full story of Grace and Robert Whitmore, we want to know what you think. Do you believe Robert deserves any sympathy at all for what he did, or do you think his insecurity simply led him down a path that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with pride? Do you think Grace was wrong to keep the true scale of her company hidden from her own husband for so many years, or do you think her instinct to protect him ended up costing her far more than it ever protected him from? Let us know exactly where you land on this story in the comments below, and if you are watching this from somewhere outside the United States, we would especially love to hear from you, so tell us where you are watching from right now. If this story kept you watching until the very end, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you never miss any of the real-life stories we bring you every single week, stories about ambition, betrayal, and the secrets that quietly build up inside even the strongest marriages. And if you thought the story of Grace and Robert Whitmore was shocking, wait until you hear what happened in our next story, a case involving a family fortune, a missing signature, and a phone call that arrived exactly 11 years too late. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and we will see you in the next one.